So what about stress? Stress is something we talk about a lot. It's a term that was really borrowed from the engineering world when we were talking about stress applied to a beam in a bridge or something like that. And it was borrowed by Hans Selye, who was a brilliant research physician at the University in Montreal, who basically started the whole concept of stress and talked about how events in a person's life are interpreted by the person as threatening or not threatening. It isn't so much necessarily what happens in our lives that causes us to have what's called stress on our physiology and metabolism. It's really how we interpret those events. If those events are seen as threatening, then we trigger in our body the only real response we have, which has come down over time in humans to be a response that originally was designed for severe forms of physical threat. So in other words, if you were a Cro-Magnon man and a tiger, a saber-toothed tiger, was chasing you, classically the response that you had was your brain would perceive danger. The brain would trigger a response in the control centers of the brain in the hypothalamus. And then from that central processing unit, a cascade of hormones would be released that would trigger a series of responses in the body, releasing adrenal gland hormones, releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine and cortisol. And those responses were designed really to help us deal with severe physical threat and to survive physical trauma. The problem is that those same responses are triggered in modern times by threats that are really not physical in nature per se, and honestly, if you really were to analyze them, are not often mortal threats or threats that were likely to cause extreme or permanent physical harm, but rather threats that may make us uncomfortable or threaten our financial stability or threaten the stability of relationships, etc. So the problem is the physical mechanism is the same. Whatever triggers the response, we get this big outpouring of adrenal hormones, we raise our blood pressure, we raise our heart rate, we cause potentially, if this stress response, so-called, is triggered every day, then we potentially raise blood pressure for a long period of time, maybe permanently. And this causes some damage, and many of the sort of illnesses that occur over decades of living can be triggered by repetitive pushing of the stress button. So we have to learn how to give ourselves a buffer between what happens outside in the world and how our inside physiology responds to that event. And that buffer, we can develop skills, meditation skills, prayer skills. We can use medications or usually nutrients that make our body less likely to over-respond to events once we interpret them as something that may affect us in some way. But by and large, the best thing to do is to learn to develop a resilience or a resistance to the triggering of the stress response in the first place. And what we'll do is we'll talk next time about the specific mechanisms that one can develop for preventing stress from causing harm to ourselves and from literally shortening our lives. This is Dr. Tom Barnard for Fresh Medical Spa and Fresh